my intention is always to understand and to encourage others to understand. So I, as the writer, am always looking into my characters and their differences and trying to find a way for me to understand them better and to become more empathetic. And I think in turn that allows my readers to do the same. Friends, it's Danny J. Norwell, and I'm here for this week's edition of the Snapshots of Spain book chats. Today we're going to be talking about Apart, which is the third novella in this short story and novella collection. And if I had to describe Apart in a nutshell, I would say that this is a story of long-distance love in a pandemic world. So if you do not want to read about the early days of the coronavirus outbreak, I understand. I would recommend you check out a different one of my stories instead. But if you are willing to stick around, I think that you'll find there really is a lot more to this story. Of course, it being the early days of coronavirus, that does move the plot along and kind of create this impetus. But that is exactly what I would say about it. I think that the obstacles that this couple faces are pushed by the coronavirus, but it really just makes them recognize and have to grapple with other obstacles and other barriers that already exist between them. So one of the major things that comes into play is the fact that this is an intercultural relationship. You have a girl from the United States and you have a guy from Spain, and so they have different cultures, different native languages, different upbringings, different experiences, and all of that really comes to a head when the coronavirus separates them. So instead of explaining this to you too much more, I'm going to jump straight into reading you an excerpt from the beginning of this novella so that the story can speak for itself. So let me do that. And thank you to those of you joining me today. I am reading from Apart, which is the third novella in the Snapshots of Spain collection. Here we go. It was a sunny March day when Lainey exited the Spanish consulate with a long sought-after piece of documentation in hand. She had been separated from her beloved fiancé Alvaro for 3 long months while she got her paperwork sorted out back home in the U.S. They had been trying to get married in Spain for half a year, but the process had been a true upward battle. They had experienced it all. Canceled appointments, missing translations, invalidated documents, and irritable government workers. They had originally planned to complete the entire marriage license process in Sevilla, the beautiful southern Spanish city they both called home. With all the difficulties that had presented themselves, though, they made the painful decision to separate in order to hasten the process. The American-Spanish couple had been together for 3 years and had never spent more than a week apart from each other in that time. When they said their goodbyes at the Sevilla airport, they had no reason to believe they would be separated for any great length of time, but it was hard nonetheless. The mere thought of living in different time zones, 6 hours apart, made both uneasy. Despite the initial hardship, the 3 months in the U.S. had flown by for Lainey. At the beginning, her heart ached constantly for Alvaro. Every time she closed her eyes, the last memory she had of him flashed into her mind. She could still picture Alvaro growing smaller and smaller as she rolled her suitcase away from him at the airport. The wide spaces and high ceilings had felt oddly sterile and suffocating that day. Moving slowly at first, she had checked back over her shoulder every few seconds. When she turned around that one last time and saw Alvaro the size of a tiny Polly Pocket doll in the distance, she waved her last goodbye and quickened her pace. It had taken everything in her not to burst into tears that day, and the memory tugged at her heartstrings each time she recalled it. And yet, it had grown easier with time to be apart from her love. Back in her childhood home, surrounded by comforting reminders of the life she had once had, her horseback riding trophies and ribbons, the colorful boy band posters, her photo collages of good times with friends, it was easy to lose herself in the small joys. She missed Spain, she missed teaching, she missed Alvaro, but it also felt good to be home. It wasn't until she was there with her family and able to gush over the proposal with her little sister Marie and leaf through wedding magazines and scheme over dresses and flowers with her mom that Lainey realized just how much she had been missing by being apart from them during this exciting stage of her life. At the same time, Lainey loved her reality abroad. She had always felt a sense of belonging in Sevilla and had chosen to take a job teaching as an auxiliar in order to return to the city where she'd studied abroad as soon as she graduated college. It was only after a year there that she had met Alvaro, the convergence of her love for Spain and their relationship resulting in a much more long-term plan for living abroad than she'd originally anticipated. It had all flowed together so seamlessly that she practically didn't question it. Practically being the key word. In Sevilla with Alvaro, everything about her life felt right on track. It surprised her that, after being welcomed back to her South Carolina home, she had fallen into a routine that somehow felt right on track, too. And she began to question, just a little bit. None of these mixed emotions were crossing her mind on that warm March day, though. After a successful consulate appointment, the only thing on her mind was sharing the feeling of euphoria with Alvaro. She grabbed a seat on the first bench in sight and whipped out her cell phone to video call her fiancé. As soon as he answered, Lainey gushed with the good news, but much to her surprise, Alvaro seemed less enthused. "So, I guess I'll look into flights as soon as I get home then," Lainey said, ignoring the way Alvaro turned his gaze away from the screen and sighed. She could tell something had to be wrong, but tried to ignore it, unable to contain herself. "Do you have any preference as to when I arrive? I'll need to check the prices and everything, but I miss you so much, I'll be there day after tomorrow if I can swing it." Alvaro smiled, but it was the weak sort of smile you muster up before bad news. Yo esperaría un poco, was all he said. "He thinks I should wait a bit? Why?" Lainey's mind began to race and jump to unlikely worst-case scenarios. "Is he about to break up with me?" she worried. "What's going on?" Lainey asked. What was going on was obvious to Alvaro, as it was to all of Europe, and most of the world, to be fair. But it had not been obvious to Lainey, who had believed the worst possible news he could give her would be related to their own relationship. The truth was that there was a pandemic sweeping the globe. Like a powerful wave of the ocean, it was moving across space and time at a steady pace. It had already broken upon the shores of Asia and left a tide of illness and death in its wake. Now, the wave was crashing upon Europe with even more force. So, that is a taste of A Part. And as I said, this is the third novella in the Snapshots of Spain collection. And I think that really opens up the floor to a lot of different themes you can see happening in this story. And I did share a number of these in advance with my followers here on Instagram, and I did get a couple of questions, so I will jump into those. But of course, if anyone here today would like to leave any questions as well, anything that's come up for you as I've been reading, whether it's about this story in particular or the themes here or something related to reading and writing in general, I would be happy to take those as well. Ooh, excuse me. But yeah, I will start out with the question I did get in advance, which comes from G of G Reads Books, and she simply asked, what made you want to write a story about intercultural relationships? And I think this, is at the heart of this story. Like I said at the beginning, it is one of the major things that drives the conflict between Lainey and Alvaro. And I guess the simple answer is that living in Spain myself and having the experiences I have, I could not imagine writing Snapshots of Spain without at least one intercultural relationship. And in reality, there are a number of stories that feature characters like this, or international and intercultural families as well. But in this story, I really chose to home in on that as the conflict, as the driving force of the plot. And I think that Lainey and Alvaro provide a perfect opportunity to do that, as does the coronavirus pandemic as well. I think I was writing these stories in 2021, I think the end of 2020 and into 2021. So at that point, we were still dealing with the pandemic in a very real way, but there was enough distance, I guess, from those early days that I was thinking about my experience. Again, as an American living in Spain, I was experiencing the pandemic in the way that Alvaro experiences it in this story. And it was very different to what was going on in the United States and what I was hearing from my friends and family. And so I think that there was a part of me that also wanted to explore that in this story. So there is the element of culture, and I think, of course, the way that we grow up, the place where we grow up, and our family and our community around us, all of those things are going to impact how we experience anything. But then also, in this case, I literally put Lainey and Alvaro back on their home country land so that they were experiencing this in such different ways. And I think that that was an interesting way to explore this really unusual time in our recent history. So that is basically the answer to my question, or I'm sorry, the answer to G's question. But I'll also add that just at its core, whenever I'm writing any story, I think that my intention is always to understand and to encourage others to understand. So I, as the writer, am always looking into my characters and their differences and trying to find a way for me to understand them better and to become more empathetic. And I think in turn that allows my readers to do the same. And so that was definitely one of the factors going into this story as well. I wanted to take a look at the Spanish perspective, at the American perspective, and kind of find this balance in between. Because like I said, it did feel very different, and sometimes that's frustrating when the pandemic was, the early days especially of the pandemic, was this global experience that felt very uniting in some ways. It was one of the only times in my life, at least, that I feel the whole world was going through something that was truly affecting the whole world like this. But at the same time that it was uniting in that way, I will say that it sometimes became frustrating how different it did feel, because each country handled it so differently, and the experience, because of that information and because of how the government was handling in each country, became very different. And so that was something that I wanted to explore as well. And I think writing this story allowed me to work through that and to kind of gain some compassion for both sides, and in this case, what Alvaro was feeling and what Lainey was feeling as well. So thank you to those of you joining, talking about A Part today. And so if you have any questions about writing or this story, specifically, A Part is the story of long-distance love in a pandemic world. And yeah, I do love this story. I know that it is one that was often difficult to write for me, because I also wanted to not make it too personal. And I had a good laugh with some of my friends in the comments when I was sharing about this story on Instagram here, because the marriage license process and all of the bureaucracy around that is something that, as you can tell from the reading, does feature in this story. And it was something that in very early drafts I really got into, and I was ranting, and of course my alpha readers reminded me, like, this is not really the essence of your story. This is not actually what you're trying to convey. This is not the true theme. And so I toned it back. And as I was reading it, I saw it there in that one paragraph where I talked about that they had pretty much had every obstacle they could imagine, and that was enough to paint the picture. But that being said, I have gone through the marriage license process in Spain. For me, it was with my husband, who's British, so we were actually dealing with 3 different countries being involved. And as anyone who has any experience with visas and paperwork of this nature, it was a big headache. So I think there was those aspects that I wanted to pepper into this story, but not necessarily make too much of a big deal out of, because yeah, it's not the main focus, but it was something that was going into it. So I think when it comes to Lainey and Alvaro's story, there's so much of it that is based in things that I can relate to, or things that come from my life or my friends' lives, but then trying to make it authentic but specific to Lainey and Alvaro and this fictional couple, and how they deal with these things instead. Ooh, talking really fast, excuse me. It is allergy season where I'm at, so I need a lot of water as well. But yeah, those are the main themes that I had planned, but also, and if you have any questions while you're here, feel free to drop them in the comments. One thing that really came to me today, more when I was reading that excerpt that I read to you, is just how much it's not only the interculturalness of the couple and how that can create language barriers and just misunderstandings and miscommunications and everything that goes along with that. But in Lainey's case, there's also this element of like, where do I belong? Because in that excerpt, you hear her talking about her life in Spain that is so perfect and right on track for everything that she wants, and she's so happy there. And yet when she goes home, she can also feel that, and it's also very comforting, and that feels right as well. And so that is definitely a theme I'm sure you can imagine that does relate very closely to my own life, because it is so difficult to choose a life that you want abroad and to build what is your dream life, but then to also have that longing and that connection back home, and kind of having these 2 personalities. Later in the story, you do have Lainey exploring it a little more, and she calls herself, American Lainey and España Lainey. And there are these different aspects of her personality, and I think that that's natural, of course. As we grow up and as we experience different things, we shift and we change, and that is normal, to not be the person you were 5 years ago or 10 years ago or 1 year ago even. But then of course in Lainey's case, and in my case, as a writer, but as myself, there's also that layer that not only is that growth happening, but it's also happening alongside this choice to be in one country or the other, and how do you come to terms with that? So as always, I don't want to spoil the story by telling you whether or not Lainey and Alvaro work these things out or how they go about doing that. I really do encourage you to read the story if it's something that is interesting to you. But I just wanted to talk with you all a little bit more about those things, these different obstacles that come up in their relationship. And I think these are topics that a lot of people can relate to, whether or not they're in an intercultural relationship, whether or not they had any of these feelings during the pandemic or have ever been to Spain. That's always my intention with these stories, to make them so specific in one sense, but in another sense to be so universal. And so I hope that if these themes are speaking to you or or sparking some kind of curiosity, you will check them out. As always, a part is available right now on Amazon, and you can find all of the links that you need here in the description of my bio. But yeah, I won't talk your ears off too much today. If there aren't any other questions, I will just end it there. But thank you so much to everyone who joined. It's always a pleasure to talk about these stories with you. And just as a little wrap up, I will add that this is the last story in the first batch of short stories and novellas that have come out in this re-release, but not to fear, next Wednesday we have this second batch of stories that will be coming out, and I can't wait to share with you those next three and talk to you more in further book chats. So as always, thank you for coming. Keep the questions coming in future book chats. If anything, comes up for you as you're reading these stories as well, you can always drop those questions into the replay later on, and I will get to them whenever I can. But thanks so much, and I hope you have a great rest of your day. Bye-bye, everyone. Happy reading, my friends.